Most of us have some sort of mental image of an ideal life in our later years. Often that centers around warm, active, loving relationships with, if we have them, our spouse, kids, grandkids, and friends. But for many, that ideal mental image seems far from their daily reality. Where we'd hoped there would be sunshine and laughter, in some cases we're experiencing darkness and emptiness. Often that disconnect is rooted in bruised or broken relationships, from unhealed wounds that may be recent or that may date back years. Since we get only one shot at this life thing, are we better off just ignoring that, hoping that time will heal us, bravely soldiering through? Or might a different response lead us to greater healing, hope, and internal freedom? To help us explore that, today we welcome special guest Jeff Konfara, a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan. For the last 4 years, Jeff has specialized in early childhood trauma. Before that, his counseling centered around individuals and couples struggling with anxiety, depression, or addiction. He also gives back professionally, both teaching counseling in a college setting and supervising beginning-level counselors. Stay tuned as Jeff helps us explore ways to get on a new path right now on the Retirement Lifestyle Show.
Welcome to the Retirement Lifestyle Show. I'm your co-host, Roshan Loungani, here with Adrian Nicholson and Eric Olson. Got another great episode today for you. Eric has been able to bring a friend to join us again today, and I'm really excited for this topic that I think will impact all of our listeners. Eric, please share with us your thoughts and where we're headed.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Roshan. So, listeners, as you know, one of the main aims of this our show is to do what we can to offer you a set of resources and ideas and inputs for your thinking to help you be in a position where retirement isn't just a financial problem to be solved, but it's also a stage of life to be really enjoyed and where your happiness level and your joy level are as high as they can be. And so some of the things that we would say are obstacles to that, or at least opportunities to expand that, include things like when you're weighed down with health problems, or you're weighed down with other things of that kind. As a result, we've brought in health and fitness people. Or if you've just been looking for something to kind of get you out of the grind and to be able to expand your horizons, we've brought in a number of different people to talk about ways of doing that just at a personal level, including volunteering and including, as we did last week, walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain and France and such. But we also recognize that there are obstacles sometimes that are just kind of weighing on you on a sort of deep level that you haven't ever necessarily resolved. And rather than just pretending that that those don't factor into our lives, or pretending that those just can be ignored, what we wanted to do was to bring in somebody whose day-to-day work is explicitly helping people resolve unresolved things that are part of their emotional and relational lives, so that they're in a position to move past that and really move back into a position of experiencing all of the joy that life itself offers. So to do that, today what I wanted to do is invite my friend Jeff Konfara to join us. Jeff is a counselor, and his work day in and day out is to help people move past some sort of hurt in their lives, and be at that on that basis to then progress into a new chapter, if you will, of what's been going on for them. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to learning from you.
Thanks for having me here. Appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff, I've spoken with you at some length, and
Yeah.
so I'll just kind of get things started here this morning. You and I were talking about the nature of your observation, at least, about what oftentimes is holding people back, and it is some wound or some rupture in a relationship. I think you said, you went so far as to say that 95% of the things that people are grappling with, you would say, are attributable to a relationship that's gone awry, or that there was some, some lack of
Yeah.
wholeness in that, and take it from there. Tell us more about that observation, or expand on that observation.
So yeah, many years ago, I was reflecting upon the reasons why people come into counseling, and it's and they can't always explicitly state what it is. A lot of times, people come in and they say it just kind of hurts here, right? And so they'll frame it as maybe I need to improve self-esteem, or I need to improve communication, or I need to stop that addiction. But as I started to explore it more, I came to find that to your point, 95% of the reason why people came into counseling is because they've been hurt by relationship. And paradoxically, 95% of the healing is through that relationship too. And so when they're hurt by relationship, we do things to avoid that hurt, right? So like we know that if we go to that family reunion, like all that stuff is going to come back. And so we do everything we can to avoid being with those people at that time, because that brings up a lot of yuckiness in us. And then we'll do other things that are less productive too, right? Like we'll seek out alcohol, or we'll seek out pornography, or eat or shop, or those sort of things. And people, oftentimes we do that until it doesn't work any longer, until we go into the doctor and the doctor's like, you got to do something about your health. Otherwise, you're not going to live any longer, right? And then that's the point where people say, I think I have a problem. I think I need to change. And that's when they come into the counseling office. I had a professor years ago who said, people only change when it's easier to change than it is to not change. And so that for many of us, that precursor to change is that doctor's office visit, or it's our spouse saying, I haven't loved you for like 10 years. And I think I'm going to leave you.
Mm.
And then that's the point where people say, I think I may have a problem. And then they come in, and through the counseling process, we experience many of those deep longings and deep hurts, and hopefully find solutions through that. Counseling works at a rate of about 70%. I tend to bring about 90% of my clients to termination, which is from beginning to end. And so then that's the process. And so I thought that this was an original idea when I came up with it. Maybe this has happened to you guys before. You sit with something and you're like, this is a profound thought. And then as I started to explore the counseling literature more, I saw that this guy named Alfred Adler, which is, many folks know, Freud kind of started the psychology movement. Adler was a contemporary of his. And this was an idea that's grounded in Adler, that we are deeply people of relationship. And when we don't have that, it manifests itself in other ways.
Well, and Jeff, I know we started talking about relationships. I've heard a lot of people needing counseling or looking into it post-COVID. Some of it is definitely relationship related, and some of it is isolation. Can you tell me what you're seeing?
So COVID was, you're right. COVID was a breeding ground for people seeking counseling. It's there's two main reasons why people seek counseling, and one is that we're dealing with something so big that we have never dealt with in our life. Think cancer, divorce, financial ruin, right? Like those are the sort of like really, really big things. But then the other reason is that we're dealing with the same thing we've dealt with for years. So anxiety. I mean, it just when we go into a meeting, we freeze up, right? And we don't know why. And so like that's been going on for years. And but we healthy people oftentimes have ways to handle that. And so a lot of us have like I live pretty close to Lake Michigan. I go for a hike by Lake Michigan, right? Some people work out, some people like read, whatever that is. Bowling, Rotary Club, church. But during COVID, those things were gone. And so all this stuff that was so hard is still there, but you don't have bowling club. You don't have Rotary Club. I don't know if they call it bowling club. You don't have bowling league. You don't have Rotary Club. You don't have church, right? And so because of that, you have both more big things happening early on in COVID, especially, right? Where just big things were going on, like people were losing their job and things like that. And then you have less of a buffer against those other things that happen. So that's the biggest phenomenon I've seen during COVID. I think most of my peers that are good counselors have been consistently busy during that stretch.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I want to go back to, you discussed just the process when somebody meets with you, Jeff, and has that conversation and they were part of a relationship that didn't go right, or they have this unhealthy habit that's been brought forth from that relationship, and it's very difficult. But like you said, it is a process. It's not something that sometimes can't be changed overnight. What are some things that you've seen people have done, like some tips that have helped people through this, getting past this relationship or getting past this habit that's come from this relationship that help? I just off the top of my head, I know it's a lot of self-reflection. Sometimes you're driving some like memories or some experiences that are very
Yeah.
difficult, and you have to confront them so you can get past it in a way, and it is a process. So what are some things or some experiences that you've seen people go through, or something that you've seen over time where you're meeting with people that can help people get through these difficult times in their lives?
So the most common pattern, so we do things as a child that are adaptive. I've spent a lot of time in my career working with kids who have pretty significant physical and sexual abuse, and the adults that they become afterwards. The ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experience study, documents the amount of folks that have been through those sort of things, and it's just a lot higher than we expect. And so people do things when they're younger that are adaptive to keep themselves alive. So I had somebody years ago who his parents didn't his parents just didn't provide for him that well. So he learned as a young child, as an 8-year-old, he could collect cans, he could make enough money, he could be resourceful, he could find a way to feed himself. And then as he started to get older, he began to rely on himself. He began to learn that I can make my own destiny. Like this is a special thing. And he became really successful. He started a business, and like it worked until it didn't work. And so he came into my counseling office when he had trouble in his marriage because his wife says he only relies on himself for everything. Like he never will trust me with anything. And so to understand why he was doing that, we had to go back to when you were younger, this was a really, really good skill. This kept you alive. But now that you're older, like this is no longer healthy. Like it's healthy to have like strong work ethic. Or if let's say you have partners in a business and you're steamrolling that over them all the time because you know that your way is the best way, because you've learned that I am the only person I can trust in my life. And so whether you do it intentionally or not, all that stuff from before is coming up. So I spend time trying to figure out, why are you doing this? And in this case of the person I brought up, like it was a good trait when he was younger. So I don't want to just beat down on it. I want to praise it and said, this kept you alive. That's pretty impressive. But like the adaptive has become maladaptive. It's no longer working for you right now. I don't know if that's an appropriate example, but
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking.
I appreciate you sharing that story, and it's just something that people just really need to consider. And sometimes, I really hate saying like turn a bad situation into a good one, but just try and drive as much positivity and just experience that you've had from it, and just see how you can maybe change it. And like I brought up that self-reflection, kind of just look at it and
Yeah.
just see how can we just adapt and change. And that's something you really should do, not on like an annual basis or whatever it is, but just always just check in just to see what you're doing, if you should change it or not, or just have that conversation with somebody. Because in that story, they were in a relationship and their wife said, hey, you have to trust me more. It took an outside person to really bring up that conversation to start with. So it can be really valuable when you get a third party opinion or just share that
Sure.
experience with somebody else. So really appreciate you sharing that with our listeners and viewers.
Cool. Thank you.
So, Jeff, with when you're when people typically, they come into your office when they know they need help. How does someone know they need help or not? They need to seek a professional. What are the signs? What should someone that is listening to this and doesn't know if they need help or not? How do they figure that out?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So like people don't wake up one day and think, what could I do today that would be fun? Should I like get a massage? Should I go golfing, or should I go to counseling?
Yeah.
Like it's not on anybody's list, right? Like we all have our things that are enjoyable, and typically what brings us to that is a state of distress. And so oftentimes, I think pretty quantitatively for a counselor, about if you go by the Myers-Briggs type indicator, about 75% of counselors are feelers. I'm more of a thinker. And so sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not helpful, right? But so I think people come into counseling when they're like, we'll say like 40% capacity, right? And so like the things that usually bring life are not bringing life anymore. So many of us have things that we can do to help. Adrian talked about like reflection. Like, I think that's a great example. I think working out. Like, we have things that we do to help self-regulate when we're not the best version of ourselves. We go through this little list of, am I sleeping enough? Am I having my quiet time, whether reflection, meditation, church, whatever that would be? Am I working out? And then when we go through that list and we're like, but I'm doing all those things and I still feel horrible, right? Like something else is going on here. I think that's a pretty big indicator when the things that are normally life-giving and normally help bring you out of that rut are no longer have the same effect. And so I think what you see in counseling over time is you see first session, people gain like 7%, and then like 6% and 5%. And then over time, it's a law of diminishing returns. And so we're not, by the time you get to the end of the process, it's maybe like session 12, 15. And it's the question is, are we still making progress? Yes, maybe like 0.5% or 0.25%. And then that's when you weigh, is it still worth time and money to continue on? So we never finish at 100%, but I think ideally when the process is done, people are operating closer to 90%. Where they're a much healthier place to re-enter the community. Hopefully, maybe it was a little quantitative there. Sorry.
Yeah. So, Jeff, this maybe is an unfair question to ask you, but I'll ask it anyway. And you can say, that's too unfair to answer. We have tried to help our listeners understand if they're going to be talking with a financial advisor and trying to understand whether that advisor is a good fit with them and actually it is, approaches it in a way, at least from our vantage point, that is client-centered and really putting the client's interest first as opposed to taking advantage of the client and so forth. I imagine that's less of a problem in the counseling profession. But if you were to try to provide people with some sort of guidelines, as if they were to say, I'm going to go talk with one or a counselor or two and see what, or at least understand kind of what their approach is and how they think and so forth, what would be some ways to kind of help them steer into a good relationship with a counselor? I'm sure part of it is just competence, part of it is fit, part of it is philosophy and outlook. What do you have any way of commenting about that?
The research would say that the majority of what creates change in a counseling relationship is what they call the therapeutic alliance. And essentially that's, do counselor and client get along well? And because it's this idea that if you don't trust the person, you're not going to share things with them that are vulnerable, that are difficult. And so some of it is certainly a huge competence piece is there. But the research would say the therapeutic alliance is, I think it's over 50% of change. I think theory accounts for about 5%. So theory is words like cognitive behavioral therapy on one end or person-centered therapy on the other end. And the research would seem to say that theory matters, but what matters more is if somebody's really good at it, right? So think if your theory's like a medical doctor believing that medicine is going to help somebody get better, or a chiropractor believing that a holistic approach is going to help somebody get better. So that helps guide the process. And then there's techniques. Those are the things you do in session. I think it's roughly about 10% of the process. And so I would say you should know within probably 3 or 4 sessions if that person is somebody you can trust and you can connect with, and you should end the process if it's not worth wasting your time and it's not worth wasting their time. So that would be I guess I would say the therapeutic. I mean, most like anybody who's doing this is going to have a master's degree. There are certainly different levels of development in our field. There are multiple, depending on the state. There are marriage and family counselors, there are psychologists, there are social workers, there's professional counselors, and there's tiers that signify if one has advanced further along. So in the professional counseling, it's limited license, and then you have a fully licensed counselor. So I would say just by nature, probably what you guys do, what most people do, Malcolm Gladwell's is 10,000 hour rules, 10,000 hour rule. Like when you just get better at it as you do it longer. And a good indicator is if they're fully licensed, but then I would also say therapeutic alliance is a big thing.
Mm. So when we talk, coming back to relationships, you've talked about things that, for example, in that one fellow's case, it was a deep past. It is his childhood, and that finally started to surface during his marriage, and so you addressed that lingering thing. Would you say, though, that since for many of our listeners, their marriage is their primary relationship now, oftentimes their kids are up and out of the home. So how much of the first of all, what percentage of your work would you say is around the marriage relationship, and then what percentage around other relationships, parent child or coworkers, or as I was mentioning to you in my case, one of the ones where I just thinking about relationships that have been the most wounding for me honestly have been at church, and it's settings there. So how does that break down?
Of who I see on my caseload?
Yeah.
That's what you're getting at?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think 10% of my caseload is marriage. Most are individual. Probably, I guess it would be 90% would be. No, I do see a group right now. So, or like a huge family. So 10%, 80% individuals. It's just easier to work with individuals because you have less people you have less variables in the room.
Okay.
You have... It's easier to work with people who are of age too, because if you're working with a child, even if they make healthy decisions, if they're in a flawed system, they can only have so much power.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll see the success rate of marriage counseling is just lower than the success rates of other counseling, because you have, even if one person becomes much healthier, the other person could still be like, I don't care. I'm not going there.
Mm-hmm.
If I still find many parts of marriage counseling intriguing because there's so many moving variables, and done well, you get to see in real time the same things that's happening in their life. So instead of saying, tell me about what happened last week, you're literally seeing when the husband says something and the wife gives him a look, and you're like, that's what goes on a lot in your household. I can see it. And then you're able to work with it in real time. And then individual counseling can be a variety of different things. So there have been many pastors I've worked with the last few years, as there's been a lot of ugly church stuff, frankly, that's come out in this stretch. And I live in a kind of a more churched area, and so I've been trying to walk people through some of those spiritual things. And some of those people have been pastors, people in authority that been helping through that process.
So, Jeff, are you seeing with when someone comes into your office initially, and Eric asked, "How do you find the right person?" How does that interaction go? So, if someone's out there listening, and they're thinking, "Okay, um, I fit the mold of what Jeff described for someone who comes in," then when they come in, what can they expect?
I just feel unconditional acceptance done well. It's a little awkward for a session, like for any of us, acknowledge the awkward piece. Like, hey, I get like you're coming here and sharing something that you've never shared with anybody, with somebody you just met. Like, a little bit awkward. Well, we get over that. You don't necessarily have to share your deepest, darkest things session one, right? Like you come around to that. So I think many of us in life have thoughts that are not always, we may know they're not healthy, but like there's this idea of unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is a counseling concept that is one of 14 micro counseling skills. It's incredibly simple, right? Like you say something to the effect of, thank you for sharing. And thank you for sharing, what it does is it takes down all those voices in our head that are there. So like, let's say I had a meeting 2 weeks ago, and immediately in that meeting with my peers, with a bunch of super intelligent people, I made a comment, and I make that comment and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm such an idiot. Like, I'm in my head, I'm like, I can't believe I said that. They're going to think I'm stupid. And then so like those thoughts just take you down a place, right? And so counseling, when you say those sort of things and somebody says, thank you for sharing. Actually, it could happen in a meeting too, honestly. If you're in a meeting and somebody says something, you're like, you say something, I'm like, such an idiot, I shouldn't have said that. And then somebody looks at you and says, thank you for sharing. You're like, oh, I'm okay, right? Like it's not the worst thing ever. And so counseling is this idea of just being fully known for all the yuckiness that was there. A few years ago, I had this this counseling experience where I was actually a client. Like I was going through some stuff with my mom, I just had cancer, and my job, the workload demands were pretty high. And I said something, and it was related to my mom's cancer. And immediately after I said it, I just couldn't believe it. It almost felt like, wow, do I really believe that? And then the counselor said, okay, that's pretty heavy, but this is important. We need to sit with this. And I just felt so cared for, because frankly, I've been around situations my whole life where people, whether in religious context or in other contexts, would say things like, you shouldn't believe that. Yeah, I get it. Like I get that I shouldn't believe that, but it's there, right? And I have to deal with that. And so to have that space where you can do that is super special. And then I would also argue, look, there's a competence piece here. So there is you should feel deeply known and deeply heard. And on the other end, you're not hanging out with your friend for coffee. So you're paying somebody for a service. There should be some deliverable that's there. So I would say I look for themes. I spend a lot of time looking for themes that are happening in relationships and interpersonal themes that are even going on in session. And then I try to highlight what those themes are. And so I would say things like session 2, your Aunt Judy, you said something, and then she said something and you got super offended. And then maybe it's a very similar thing with her husband and a very similar thing in counseling too. So that's kind of the deliverable. That's kind of the what people expect. Like you want higher level listening that's going to provide a different level than you would in a coffee shop context, I guess. That was a long answer. Sorry.
Very good point, Jeff. The next question I have is, I guess like a theme is like a cycle, or let's just say somebody meets with you, they talk to you about maybe an issue that they're having, they have multiple sessions with you, and then towards the end of it, they feel sort of complete, like they got past it. Well, let's just say a year later, they come back to you after not meeting with you for some time and say, hey, Jeff, it happened again. I found myself in this sort of cycle, and I'm back here again where I thought, I got through it. I was better, but here I am again. And I think the thing is just being consistent and maybe being proactive, where maybe you got through a tough relationship, or you're going through something and you got through it, but there's always that maybe thought in the back of my mind, will I put myself in this situation again? Or could this happen to me again? What could I do now to maybe prevent this from happening again? Or what can I do now where I can have some more reassurance? Do you kind of follow where I'm going with this?
You're getting at this idea of a client who would conclude the process and be pretty healthy when the process is done, and then maybe something else arises that reactivate that about maybe a year down the line.
Kind of like a trigger what happened again, where everything was good, and then that thing comes up again, where it kind of like affects the process or everything that they built up. I guess that might help you more get out what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty common. Where in fact, my last session with people, I always say something to the effect of, I believe you're ready now. Like it is, we can't hold on to this forever. It's time for you to move on, right? Like my goal is not to keep a client for longer than we should, because it's just, we want them to be the healthiest version of themselves and then go out into the world, right? And with that being said, there are things that come up that, as you said, reactivate that. So I may have processed through a lot of deaths in my life and really got to a healthy place. But then a year down the line, if I lose another close loved one, it's going to bring me pretty close to the place, hopefully not completely down to where I was in the first place, because I've worked through a lot of those things, but it's going to be hard, and that's going to bring those sort of things back. And so I would say to those people, yes, come back. Let's continue to work on that. And then what's beautiful is you already have rapport built at that point. So there's already a trusting relationship. So almost like an old friend you haven't seen in years, where you see them and you're like, it's like nothing ever like was gone, and you can just immediately go to that level of depth. And so I would say it's pretty common what you're talking about, and I would encourage people to do that.
So are there proactive ways for people to like take care of it now, or like maybe techniques, or even as simple as like breathing exercises or whatever it may be, to where they get past it and just something they can do to, or just check in on like a certain period or something, where they can just make sure that they're at least doing something compared to when they previous met with you before they really handled the issue, that they can just, have something they go to?
Sure, you're right. Things like breathing techniques would be healthy things. So just like healthy lifestyles, I think are going to make it like back to working out, back to reading, back to growing intellectually. There's something called the wellness wheel that says we have eight like spheres of wellness, and if we're taking care of each of those spheres, we're going to be healthier people.
Oh, that's
So like if we're growing intellectually and taking care of our environment and being in relationship with people, that's just going to make it easier, right? Where it's going to make us less vulnerable. Things can still happen, but we're less vulnerable to self-esteem threats at that point. I don't know if that completely answered
that
those are my
does
thoughts.
that definitely hits it right there. Kind of creating like a better environment, building every day, just being stronger than the next day. So if something
Right.
does come up, you're able to handle it as best you can.
Right. Let's not go back into the same pattern that we were trying to get out of. So like that's you say you want to take care of yourself physically and you've done really good. Like let's stick with that. Not that you have to work out every day at 5:30 for 2 hours, but like let's do something. Let's move that forward. You say that you value relationships and friendships and that you're extremely lonely and that counseling was so great for you because you had somebody to talk to. Find an hour in your week to schedule time with a friend to meet with them. And if you do that consistently, that's going to achieve some of the purpose and some of the function of
Yes, the
counseling.
consistency, like you mentioned, is sometimes key to all of this. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jeff, I wonder about what might be going through the minds of some of our listeners. Some of them are hearing this and they're thinking, boy, that I definitely am persuaded here. I think this would be something that would be really valuable for me. And maybe a few other listeners, if they haven't tuned out already, because they say, I have no need for this, are nevertheless, they're committed to listening, but they're saying there's no way that I would ever do that. Do you see any sort of pattern in the population as to what sort of correlates with receptivity and openness to take advantage of counseling, and what tends to correlate with a resistance or stiff arming of that prospect?
Okay. I think generational. You're going to see some things with that. I think
Mm-hmm.
my dad would have been in a time where we don't go to counseling. We don't do the like kind of get at bootstraps, right? Like you kind of just do what you need to do and push through. Paradoxically, that's some of the most healing, right? When I'm meeting with somebody that age group, oftentimes men who are less likely to seek counseling too.
Mm-hmm.
The healing happens very quickly because it's all this stuff that have been piling up for years, and they finally have somebody to share this stuff, and those are beautiful environments. I'm thinking about a few clients I have that would fit that mold right now. So I would say, yeah, in general, younger folks, probably under 40, more willing to seek out counseling. I would say women more likely to seek out counseling. I would say parents much more likely to have their kids seek counseling, even if they are the ones who created the reason why their kids need counseling. So had parents call and say, we're getting divorced and our kid is having temper tantrums every day. Can you see him? I'm a family systems guy. I say, let's bring the whole family in. Let's work this. They're like, we just want you to talk to our kid. We're like, something you're doing is kind of contributing to this, not telling people they shouldn't get divorced. But so I would say, yeah, folks who are younger, women, and are probably more likely. But I would argue that it's healthy for everybody.
Jeff, I remember when I studied the science of happiness, they talked about the value of a gratitude journal. Are there things like that are out there that are just healthy for everyone to use, or tips for our listeners, things they can do just to be in a better place from a mental health perspective?
I love the idea of a gratitude journal. That's beautiful. I mean, we become less negative when we think about the things that we're thankful for. Yeah, from a spiritual side, I think meditation, prayer. From a so you're talking more like, see, for me, the mind is not bifurcated from the body. So like it's my mind is healthiest as my body is strongest. So for me, that's I'm taking care of my body, I'm taking care of my environment, and I would go back to the wellness wheel for that. Like if we have a piece of each of those 8 sections of the wellness wheel that we're doing. One is environmental, one is emotional, one is I think relational, one's intellectual. Like that those are things that we are feeling more complete. And when we don't, right, like even if we're learning tons, if we're not taking care of our body, our emotional health is going to suffer. Trying to think of other kind of simple things that would be that you could do every day. That's what comes to mind. That's what I have.
Mm-hmm. Roshan, do you have another question?
Yeah.
If not, I have one.
Well, I just want to go back to, you'd mentioned the wellness wheel, and I think I've heard of it, but it's been a long time, so I actually looked it up. I just want to read off what those are for
That'd be
everyone
great.
listening. The 8 different components are emotional, environmental, financial, intellectual, occupational, physical, social, and spiritual. So, Eric, please go ahead with your question now.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's related to I don't have the statistics, but just related to the reports that coming out of COVID, we saw a kind of crisis in all of this with, as you know, we've talked a little bit earlier in this episode about COVID and the lockdowns and the isolation that stemmed from it. But, I hear about a giant spike in suicides and
Yeah.
suicidal ideation and things of this nature. So, if has there been because you've been at this for a while, so have you seen any sort of shift in the nature of what people are grappling with, or is it just an intensification of the similar sorts of things that you previously seen people grappling with in the wake of the COVID experience for us all?
I would say loneliness is the highest I've ever seen it. Loneliness breeds anxiety. Loneliness breeds it's a depression. Like, this is the very thing that is your healing, is to be with people, but it's the very thing you don't want to do. So you turn inside and you become more depressed. And
Mm,
then other people don't want to be with you as much because you're depressed, which keeps the
mm,
system going over and over again. Uh, so because theoretically, I believe the key is relationship, I think the most detrimental thing we can do is pull away from relationship. But
mm,
because we're afraid of somebody having COVID, we pull away. Like, in church context, we stopped going to buildings. We started watching online. And this is applied in offices. We stopped going into work, and things are, people are working from home. And some of that's great, right? Like, I love the flexibility, being able to turn on the computer and not have to drive an hour. Like, some of that's really, really good. Uh, but we just have to acknowledge that there's a cost. There's a cost when we're not with people.
mhm,
And COVID has, I mean, we've been trending this way for a while, honestly, with technology. And my grandma, this is funny, my 95-year-old grandma is trying to wrap her mind around counseling. And she's like, Jeff, what is it? Like, in her time, they just didn't have counseling. And I said, Grandma, you remember when you were a kid and you were younger, and people used to go out on their porch, and they would just sit there, and then the neighbors would come over and you would talk to them. And my grandma she's like, yeah, she's kind of reminiscing. She's going back. I said, it's kind of like that, Grandma. It's kind of like we're in this community with each other, and we're talking and we're being kind and we're caring about other people. And it's something that when my grandma was that age, that's what people did. But now
mhm,
this is countercultural. And so I would argue, if everybody was living in the day of my grandma and going out on their front porch and talking and hearing your neighbor's story, not retreating to the computers, the televisions, the phones, everything that is, then we just wouldn't need this as much.
mm.
But because we have all these other things, we're addicted to productivity, and devices make it more lonely, right? I mean, all these sort of things just kind of lead toward um, the need for counseling, and COVID has just exacerbated that process.
Jeff, can you
That's such.
expand on that? I'm sorry, Eric, but devices leading to loneliness. Can you expand on that?
Um, so I believe, yeah, I think so. I mean, studies I've seen on social media use, on just phone scrolling, like, you don't feel better when you're done with it. You get done with it's a in contrast to a workout where you work out for an hour, you're like, that was hard, but I feel good. Like, when you're when you're in these spaces, you don't oftentimes feel better about life. It makes you, it gives us the very thing that we don't want, right? So, I mean, social media is promises, or in the past is you have your friends. And in contrast, it makes us feel more alone. And so I think technology is neutral. I don't want to make technology out to be a bad thing, but technology, it's hard to talk to people. And a lot of folks, younger folks specifically, this is where younger folks are at a distinct disadvantage. My 15-year-old son knows more about technology than I do, but that's not what's going to get him a job in like 10 years. Like, he needs to be able to talk to people, because he's going to be competing against his peers who really don't know how to talk to people. It's because they haven't been raised in this environment that that values those interpersonal skills. And so those who are able to do that, I truly believe, are going to rise up in organizations because of that ability. I think it's going to become a commodity, the ability to be able to talk to people. I don't know if I completely answered that question. Technology being neutral, I'm not certainly don't want to frame it as a negative, but I think it does make us more lonely.
Well, it's as you're sitting there, as I'm sitting here listening to what you're saying, Jeff, I'm thinking about the contrast between the neighborhood that I was in before and the neighborhood I'm in now. And each had its own sort of mechanisms of getting people out and talking with one another. There were some people who I would say were just garage door opener families, where they would, click in, drive into the garage, click down, and there was no interaction ever with anyone. And others would just, take a time, if they saw a neighbor out in the front yard, that they would hop out of their car, they'd walk over and they'd catch up a little bit. And here in my new neighborhood, it's sort of the same thing, except that it's people just set up those little fire pits, and they'll set up their sets of chairs in the driveway, and they'll welcome people to come by. And there's usually, oftentimes a couple extra chairs whose intent
That's
is
cool.
to just create a welcoming environment, which I value very much. Yeah. So city planners and architects take note about
Yeah.
the ways to promote social interaction. So I've got a couple other questions, but Roshan or Adrian, if you have something you want to hop in on, I'll pause.
You can go ahead, Eric.
Okay. So Jeff, before I forget this, I want to make sure that we give people a way to contact you. So if people said, man, I really like the way in which Jeff approaches all of this, and first of all, do you do things on a remote basis? Or do you strictly do things on an in-person basis here in West Michigan?
Right. Good question. So counseling, and this is where you get like, if you're counseling somebody between states, my license is only in the state of Michigan. Counseling laws are very specific about that. As you enter into this form of life coaching or consulting, the rules get a little bit more murky and a little different. And so you're allowed to talk to somebody in a different state. You are allowed to charge somebody from a different state. You cannot do that if you're calling it counseling. So that's kind of a unique distinction on that.
Okay, well then, for our Michigan listeners, or if the people who want to travel from a nearby state to see you and see you in Michigan, how would people reach you? What's the best way to get a hold of you and find you? I noticed you have a website as well.
Sure, my website is konfaracounseling.com. That's probably the best way to reach out. There's a contact me link there.
Okay, fantastic. And just one other question that I had for you was just about how you got into this. I mean, there was a time you were a student or what have you, and you probably were thinking about all sorts of different possible directions. What led you into counseling?
I was a undergraduate business major in finance. Worked sales for a few years. I quickly found out that the idea of calling, I was in inside sales, calling on the phone all day was not life-giving for me. Started to ask the question of what's next, and thought MBA could have been that route. I had met with ended up going to thinking I may get into some sort of like, I liked working camps in the past, and ended up going to a school that had like a ministry. I think it was a youth ministry program I was thinking of, and just out of, I'm like, I want to work with people. I want to impact youth in some way. I don't really know how to do that because I never experienced counseling before. Like a high school, like a college student who had a great high school math teacher who wants to become a math teacher. I just didn't have that experience. I never had a counselor. I never had, my childhood was, I mean, it just, not that I didn't have things I could work on. And then as I was registering for classes for my master's degree program, in 1 week, both my wife and somebody else said something to the effect of, "You're pretty good at listening. Have you thought about counseling before?" I said, "No, I never have." And so, but that led me to take a class in counseling, and I thought, I think I can be pretty good at this, and I think this is pretty enjoyable for me. And so I would say I stumbled in it, and it's just been a good fit. It's been good for me.
Hmm. That's a great story. I mean, you mentioned earlier that many of the people who do what you do on the Myers-Briggs have more of a feeling orientation. You have more of a thinking orientation. You mentioned now the finance background and all that. I can see how that might be there.
It's counseling. I've been told counseling is a field that self-selects. So people encourage your listening skills, and then that's what usually leads somebody into that process.
That's great.
Excellent.
Roshan or Adrian, anything else?
No, Jeff, I just want to say thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for all your expertise. It was very helpful.
Yeah, Jeff, is there any other things you want to share with our listeners or viewers that you want to touch on today, or any parting thoughts that you think would be good for them to end it on?
Anything that I'm sitting on, huh? I I feel like I should have a profound thought to end this. I don't think I do.
I definitely appreciate all the stories and the advice that you've given our listeners and viewers today. It was it's definitely a lot to think about, and it's definitely an area we haven't really focused too much on it. But the value of it, I can really see it.
Yeah, Jeff, I thank you so much, because I mean, I think about, we're talking with people about decades of life after they've said goodbye to a lot of workplace relationships, and they're also oftentimes in a stage of life where the kids aren't at home, so the regularity of contact with their own children, if they've had them, that's not present anymore, and so when the set of relationships that you're actively engaging with on a day-to-day basis has shrunk in that way, if you're not doing something to try to figure out how you stay in those sorts of relationships, I can imagine it can get to kind of a pressure cooker state for some people, where it's just a lot of weight is resting on a few relationships, if any. And so to be able to sort of restore health to those relationships, as you've identified, I think would be a big advantage. So listeners, thank you so much for hanging with us until now. I just want to encourage you, if you have any questions, to reach out to Jeff. You can go to the website, and you can also go to our show notes and find Jeff's contact information there. Again, that's the website address is retirementlifestyleshow.com. There you also can find our past episodes and contact information for us. We have said nothing here about financial planning, nothing here about investment management. But if that is a concern of yours and that was why you were listening today, well, feel free to reach out. But we look forward to you rejoining us next week, when we'll come back with another episode of the Retirement Lifestyle Show.